Here's a question that sounds almost too obvious to ask. If we don't want AI models to know how to synthesize bioweapons or run disinformation campaigns or do other dangerous things, why do we teach them in the first place? Like, these models learn from text. They learn what we feed them. So if there's something we don't want them to know, couldn't we just not include it in the training data? It sounds naive, and for years, the AI safety community has mostly ignored this approach in favor of more sophisticated methods. Things like RLHF, constitutional AI, machine unlearning, techniques that try to remove or suppress dangerous capabilities after the model has already learned them. But here's the thing, those methods don't work very well. They can be bypassed with jailbreaks, they can be reversed with a little fine-tuning, and this creates what researchers call a cat and mouse game. Every time you patch one vulnerability, attackers find another. So a team from Anthropic and Stanford decided to revisit the obvious question. What if we actually tried filtering the training data, not as a naive first attempt, but as a serious, rigorous intervention? And what they found is kind of surprising. The paper is called Shaping Capabilities with Token-Level Data Filtering, and the core idea is simple. Instead of training a model on everything and then trying to make it forget dangerous stuff, you just don't train it on that stuff to begin with. But the key insight, and this is what makes the paper interesting, is about the granularity of filtering. Previous work on data filtering operated at the document level. You train a classifier to identify documents that contain dangerous content, and you remove those entire documents from your training set. The problem is that this is wasteful. A lot of documents contain a mix of benign and sensitive information. A biology textbook might have one paragraph about pathogen synthesis in a chapter that's otherwise completely fine. If you filter at the document level, you throw out the entire textbook. You lose a lot of useful training signal. So this paper asks, what if we filtered at the token level instead? The idea is to train a classifier that can identify which specific tokens in a document are relevant to the capability you want to suppress. Then, during pre-training, you just skip those tokens, either by masking the loss so the model doesn't learn to predict them, or by replacing them entirely with a special hidden token. And this works really well. To test this, the researchers used medicine as a proxy domain. They weren't actually trying to remove dangerous capabilities. That would require training models at a scale they couldn't afford. Instead, they tried to train models that couldn't do medicine while preserving their ability to do related things like biology. Medicine is a good test case because it's a coherent domain with clear boundaries, good benchmarks, and enough training data to get meaningful signal even at smaller scales. They trained models ranging from 61 million to 1.8 billion parameters, comparing 4 conditions: a baseline with no filtering, document-level filtering, token-level filtering with loss masking, and token-level filtering with token removal. And the results are pretty striking. First, token filtering Pareto dominates document filtering. For any given level of degradation on the target domain, medicine, token filtering causes less collateral damage to related domains like biology. You get the same suppression with less waste. Second, and this is the key finding, filtering gets more effective as you scale. For their largest models, 1.8 billion parameters, token filtering produced what they call a 7,000x compute slowdown on the medical domain. That means to match the medical capabilities of a normally trained model, you'd need to spend 7,000 times more compute training the filtered model. That's not a small effect. And third, this scales better than the alternative approaches. They compared filtering to RMU, that's representation misdirection for unlearning, a state-of-the-art unlearning method. RMU tries to scramble the model's internal representations of dangerous knowledge after training. RMU actually starts with worse performance on the target domain, higher loss on medical text. But when you try to fine-tune the model to recover those capabilities, RMU crumbles almost immediately. A few steps of adversarial fine-tuning and you're back to baseline. Models trained with data filtering, on the other hand, degrade much more gradually. For the 1.8 billion parameter models, token filtering was about 10 times more robust to this kind of attack. The intuition here is that unlearning methods are trying to suppress knowledge that's still encoded in the weights, The information is there, it's just being masked. Filtering removed the information at the source. The model never learned it in the first place, so there's nothing to recover. Now, one concern you might have is that filtering makes models harder to control. Like, say you filter out all medical knowledge. Now, when someone asks your model a medical question, what happens? It doesn't know medicine, so it can't give a good answer, but it also doesn't know that it doesn't know medicine, so maybe it just hallucinates confidently. This is a real worry. Previous work on filtering toxic content found exactly this problem. Models trained on less toxic data were actually worse at recognizing when they should refuse to engage with toxic queries. But capability filtering seems to work differently. The researchers tested this by training their filtered models to refuse medical questions while still answering general questions normally. And surprisingly, models trained with token filtering were actually better at this task than the baseline. The token-filtered models generalized to refusal more easily, not less. The hypothesis is that toxicity filtering and capability filtering are fundamentally different tasks. With toxicity, the model has still seen toxic tokens, just not in toxic contexts, so it's hard for it to learn when to refuse. With capability filtering, the model literally hasn't seen medical tokens, so when it encounters them at inference time, they're out of distribution in an obvious way. The model can learn, when I see tokens I wasn't trained on, refuse. This is a nice result, because it suggests filtering doesn't force you to choose between safety and controllability. You can have both. Okay, so filtering works, but there's an obvious practical problem. How do you actually classify millions of tokens as medical or not medical? Labeling documents is relatively easy. You can just ask an LLM. But token-level labels are harder to get. You can't reasonably have a human or even an LLM label every individual token in a massive pre-training corpus. The researchers came up with a clever solution using sparse autoencoders. If you've watched some of my previous videos, you'll know that SAEs are a tool from mechanistic interpretability. You train them to decompose model activations into interpretable features. So instead of a dense, uninterpretable activation vector, you get a sparse vector where each dimension corresponds to something meaningful, like medical terminology or legal jargon. The insight here is that SAE features come with natural language descriptions, so you can use those descriptions to automatically identify which features are relevant to your target domain. Here's how it works. First, you take a pre-trained SAE. They used one from Gemascope, and identify all the features whose descriptions are related to medicine. You do this by asking an LLM to classify each feature description. Then, for any given token in your corpus, you check, does this token activate strongly on multiple medical features? If so, label it as medical. Finally, you do a propagation step. If a token is adjacent to an already labeled medical token and it activates on at least one medical feature, label it too. This helps you capture full spans like insert the catheter rather than just the keyword catheter. The labels you get from this process are noisy, but the researchers framed this as a weak to strong generalization problem. You don't need perfect labels, you just need labels that point in roughly the right direction, and then you train a small classifier to generalize from those labels. They trained bidirectional language models specifically for this classification task and found that small domain-specific models outperformed much larger general-purpose models like modern BERT. A 224 million parameter model trained on biomedical text achieved F1 scores around 0.89 on their test set. And importantly, the whole pipeline is cheap. Running inference with a 224 million classifier is a tiny fraction of the compute you're spending on pre-training anyway. There's one more important finding about label quality. You might worry that token-level filtering requires perfect labels. If your classifier makes mistakes, labeling some medical tokens as benign or some benign tokens as medical, doesn't that undermine the whole approach? The answer is yes, but less than you'd think. The researchers tested this by artificially adding noise to their labels. And yes, more noise means less effective filtering, but the relationship is sublinear. You can tolerate a lot of mistakes before filtering stops working entirely. More importantly, if you have a weak classifier, you can compensate by being more aggressive with your threshold. Set the classifier to high recall, accept that you'll filter out some benign tokens, and scale up your model to compensate for the reduced training signal. This isn't free. Aggressive filtering hurts performance across the board. But if you're in a regime where you can afford more compute, bad classifiers can still be good filters. They also showed that token-level classifiers can bootstrap from weak labels in a way that document-level classifiers can't. If you train a small, weak model to generate labels, and then use those labels to train a larger, stronger model, the strong token-level classifier improves over its weak teacher. Document-level classifiers don't show this weak to strong generalization. They just inherit the mistakes. So what are the takeaways here? First, the obvious approach works. If you don't want a model to know something, not teaching it that thing is surprisingly effective, more effective than trying to remove the knowledge after the fact. Second, granularity matters. Token-level filtering beats document-level filtering because it's more precise. You can remove dangerous tokens without throwing away entire documents of useful context. Third, this scales in the right direction. Bigger models don't somehow learn to recover filtered capabilities. They actually get worse at the filtered domain relative to baseline. That's a good property for a safety intervention to have. Fourth, filtering doesn't break controllability. You can still teach filtered models to refuse queries in the filtered domain, and they might even be better at it than unfiltered models. And fifth, you don't need perfect labels. The SAE-based pipeline gives you noisy supervision, but token-level classifiers are robust enough to generalize from that noise. Now, some important caveats. This paper uses medicine as a proxy for dangerous capabilities. Medicine is a reasonable test case, but it's not the same as, say, bioweapons synthesis or cyber attack techniques. Those domains might have different properties. They might be more entangled with benign knowledge, or harder to define cleanly at the token level. The largest models in this paper are 1.8 billion parameters. That's still pretty small compared to frontier models. The scaling trends look good, but we don't actually know if they continue at GTP4 scale. And filtering is still a blunt instrument. You're removing knowledge based on what tokens look like, not based on whether they actually contribute to dangerous capabilities. Some influential tokens might slip through the classifier because their influence is indirect. The authors are clear about this. They advocate for defense in depth, filtering as one layer of protection, not the only one. Filtering handles the pre-training phase. You still want inference time safeguards for deployment. But as an intervention, filtering has a nice property that other approaches lack. It's robust to the most obvious attacks. You can't jailbreak a model into using knowledge it never had. You can't fine-tune capabilities back in if they were never learned. And that makes it a valuable tool. Maybe not the whole solution, but a foundation that other safeguards can build on. One last thought. There's something philosophically interesting about this approach. Most AI safety work tries to shape model behavior, to get models to act safely even though they have dangerous capabilities. Filtering tries to shape model capabilities directly, to build models that genuinely can't do certain things. These feel like different strategies. One is like teaching someone to be responsible with a weapon. The other is like not giving them the weapon in the first place. Neither is obviously better in all situations, but it's good to have both options. And this paper suggests that the "don't give them the weapon" approach is more viable than people might have assumed. Alright, that's the paper. If you're interested in this stuff and want more AI research explained, you probably know what to do at this point. See you in the next one.